The flight crew thought they were silencing just another passenger. They didn't know the quiet man in seat 1A owned the sky beneath their wings. Picture it, pristine first-class cabin, a blonde attendant ripping a boarding pass in half, and a mother's stunned eyes as her son, global fintech titan Donovan Raye, is told. People like you don't sit up here. No shouting, no scene. Donovan simply sits, and within 10 minutes every Orionis Air jet on 4 continents grinds to a halt. How does a single gesture topple an airline's polished facade? Why does Donovan carry a stained scarf in his briefcase, and what secret clause lets him shut down a billion-dollar fleet from one leather seat most of all? How does a son turn humiliation into a movement that rewrites the rules of flight for every traveler? Everywhere buckle up. This is a story of silent power, a mother's dignity, and the day the skies were forced to choose between profit and respect. If you're ready to witness a reckoning at 30,000 feet, smash that like button. Share this with every frequent flyer you know, and hit subscribe because justice is about to board, and it's not checking baggage. The boarding gate hummed with a kind of practiced chaos, families clustering around carry-ons, a mother whispering something to her son, a businessman checking his watch 3 times in the span of a minute. Gate A16 blinked calmly above them all. Orionis Air Flight 306, Washington, D.C. to Amsterdam. First-class boarding now. The announcement rolled over the crowd like a gentle wave. The rope line separated the passengers, neatly economy to the left, premium to the right. On the right side, suit jackets brushed against soft leather briefcases. A man in loafers scrolled through stocks. Someone was sipping from a reusable metal water bottle that cost more than a coach ticket. Donovan Raye walked toward the first-class lane with steady, deliberate steps. He didn't rush. He didn't pause. He simply moved like a man who had boarded planes before. Hundreds of them. He stood tall, maybe 6'3", with skin the color of polished walnut, framed by a tailored charcoal suit. The lapel bore no branding, no flair, just fabric that fell into place exactly as it should. In his hand, he held a silver-edged boarding pass. His other hand was empty, hanging calmly by his side. No entourage, no flash, just presence. He waited in line quietly. When his turn came, the gate agent, a young woman with braces and nervous energy, extended her hand toward his pass, but before she could scan it, someone stepped forward from behind the podium. "Excuse me," came the voice, cool, confident, managerial. It was Marla Jennings, the head flight attendant for Flight 306. Blonde hair tightly wound, blazer pristine, and heels clicking with intention. She didn't look at the agent. She didn't ask for identification. She didn't smile. Instead, she glanced at Donovan, then at his pass, then back at him, and without a word, she reached forward, took the pass out of his hand, and tore it clean down the middle. A long, precise rip. "You're at the wrong gate," she said flatly. "Try boarding with coach, or wherever your seat is actually supposed to be." She dropped the torn halves of the pass on the counter like receipts she no longer needed. The gate agent's face flushed with discomfort. A man 2 spots behind Donovan shuffled his feet and looked away. A woman in a cream blouse clutched her purse just a little tighter. No one said anything. No one stopped her, but no one could look away. Donovan didn't react. No furrowed brow, no raised voice, no visible sign that something had shifted. He simply bent down, picked up the 2 halves of his ticket, folded them once neatly, and slid them into the inside pocket of his jacket. Then he stepped forward, past her, onto the jet bridge, without asking permission. Inside the aircraft, the air changed. The cabin lighting shifted from terminal white to a gentle golden hue, soft like candlelight against warm-toned walls. The seats, 8 of them in first class, were arranged like individual cocoons of privilege. Polished leather, brass accents, personal touchscreens softly glowing. Seat 1A, his. He placed his carry-on in the overhead, removed his jacket with practiced ease, and sat, slowly, silently. He folded his hands across his lap and leaned back, not into comfort, but into composure. He didn't touch the screen, didn't recline, didn't request champagne. He simply breathed and waited. Behind him, the other passengers filtered in. Some noticed him, most pretended not to. But there was something unsettling about his stillness, about a black man in a premium seat without apology or performance. His silence filled the space between rows. It pulled eyes sideways, it tightened shoulders. 3 rows behind him, a young man in a graphic hoodie pulled out his phone and pressed record, just in case, in economy. A woman in her 70s gently adjusted her purse and looked up from her seat in 27C. She had soft gray curls and glasses perched on a chain. Her name was Evelyn Raye. She didn't look at the flight map or the magazine in the seat back pocket. She looked straight ahead, through the curtain, toward her son. She didn't say a word, didn't need to. She had seen it before. Not like this, not in premium lighting and leather seats, but in train cars, restaurant lines, bus stops, interview rooms, same ritual, different uniforms. Back in first class, the boarding process continued. Polite greetings, champagne offered, coats folded with exaggerated care. And yet, beneath it all, something else had begun. An unease, a question unspoken. What happens now? Marla returned. This time, she didn't speak from behind the gate. She stepped into the cabin, posture flawless, lips set in a line so sharp it might cut glass. She stopped in front of 1A. "Are you sure you're supposed to be here?" she asked. Not curious, just annoyed. Donovan turned his head slightly, did not answer, just met her gaze. Marla tilted her head. "You know, money buys a seat, but not access, not credibility." She lifted a small scanner and pointed it toward his seat panel. Beep, beep, red light. She smiled, almost. "Looks like your seat wasn't properly assigned after all," she said. "We'll get you rebooked. Please return to the front so we can resolve it." Still, Donovan didn't move. Instead, he reached into his jacket and removed a small black card metallic engraved with the name Donovan Raye, Aon Vest Strategic Tier Access. He laid it gently on the tray in front of him. Marla glanced at it for barely half a second. "Nice card," she muttered, "but it doesn't change the manifest." She turned to walk away. Donovan didn't stop her. He didn't have to. The weight of his silence was beginning to spread, not in volume, but in velocity. Passengers began to murmur softly. One man lowered his newspaper just an inch. Another woman fidgeted with her scarf, her gaze fixed nowhere but everywhere. The lights above dimmed as the cabin doors prepared to close. But something else had opened. Not a door, not a gate, but a moment. A moment when the lie of professionalism met the truth of presence. And the plane hadn't even left the ground. It wasn't the sound of the tear itself that haunted him. It was what it represented. Donovan sat motionless in 1A as the jet bridge door sealed behind the last boarding passenger. The low hum of the aircraft system settled into a rhythm, a kind of quiet anticipation. But for Donovan, the real turbulence had already started. It hadn't come from the engines, it had come from a human hand. The way Marla Jennings had looked at him wasn't personal. It was practiced. That's what disturbed him more. Her words hadn't cracked with confusion or surprise. They had been methodical, mechanical, like she had done it before. Like this was protocol, unwritten but ingrained. Donovan had built empires in boardrooms where every word mattered. But what had just occurred at the gate wasn't a mistake in language. It was a failure of recognition, of humanity. The boarding pass in his pocket was now split in two, but his composure was still intact. Almost. He stared out the oval window beside him. Washington was beginning to fade into evening, the sky a soft wash of steel blue and violet. On the tarmac, service carts zigzagged like ants. Flight crews moved like clockwork. Everything was in motion, except for the feeling in his chest, somewhere behind him. The curtain separating first class from business fluttered slightly as someone walked past it. Then it closed again. Another boundary, another division. A quiet chime sounded overhead. The intercom came to life. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Orionis Air Flight 306 with nonstop service to Amsterdam. Our flight time today will be approximately 7 hours and 15 minutes. Please direct your attention to the safety demonstration located on your seat screen or follow along with the crew. Donovan didn't move. He had seen this performance thousands of times: safety vests, oxygen masks, exits fore and aft. But never had he felt less safe on a plane. And not because of the altitude. A flight attendant approached with champagne flutes balanced on a silver tray. Her name tag read Kara. Her eyes flicked to Donovan for a moment, hesitating before offering the glass. He accepted it, but didn't drink. "Everything all right, sir?" she asked softly. Donovan looked at her, then offered the faintest nod. "Very good. Please let me know if you need anything," she added, her voice noticeably warmer than Marla's had been. She didn't linger, but she didn't rush off either. She gave him space. It was the first moment of basic decency since the gate. He leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes for a brief second. And that's when it hit him. The rip, not just of the ticket, of dignity, of knowing that even now, in a tailored suit, holding a premium access card, seated in 1A, he was still subject to suspicion. Still an intruder in a space he had long since earned. He remembered being 9 years old, sitting on the back porch of his aunt's house in Baton Rouge, watching airplanes streak across the sky. He used to think the people on board were all important, all destined, all chosen. That was before he realized the world chose carefully and often wrongly who belonged where. Suddenly, a voice crackled over the intercom again. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your head flight attendant, Marla Jennings. We are just moments from pushback. Please ensure all carry-on items are stowed, tray tables are secured, and electronic devices are in airplane mode." Her voice had returned, crisp and clean like a glass edge, but it was followed by a pause, a whisper behind the curtain, a shuffle of shoes, and then, "Sir, may I have a word?" Marla's shadow fell over his seat again. She didn't kneel. She didn't lower her voice. She simply stood there, hands clasped in front of her. "Mr. Raye," she began, emphasizing his name with forced politeness. "I've been informed there may have been a mix-up in our seat and manifest. It appears your ticket, while valid, is showing as duplicate flagged in the system. We'll be needing to relocate you to seat 11D in business class until we can resolve the issue in Amsterdam." Donovan looked up slowly. "There is no duplicate," he said calmly. Marla smiled tightly. "Sir, these things happen. Our system is quite robust, but not without its occasional hiccups. My assistant booked this flight 6 weeks ago," he continued, voice even. "The ticket was confirmed 3 times. I received the upgrade confirmation 2 days ago. There is no error." Marla's eyes narrowed just slightly. "Well, I'm afraid the decision is final. Our system has flagged the issue, and I need to ask you to comply." Donovan didn't move, didn't raise his voice. He simply asked, "And if I don't," Marla blinked, "then we will need to remove you from the flight entirely." The words hung there, bold and bare. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a threat. At that moment, a hush fell over the cabin. The businessman in 1B tilted his head ever so slightly. The woman in 2A lowered her Kindle. Even the boy in 3C, who had been humming softly to himself, fell silent. Donovan stared at Marla, not with rage, not with fear, but with a profound, still silence, a silence full of generations behind it. Then, slowly, he reached into his inner jacket pocket. He removed a second item, one that looked almost identical to the black card he had shown earlier, but this one had a golden emblem. He turned it over and placed it in Marla's hand. She looked down and froze. "Orionis Strategic Owner Class Identification, Tier Omega, issued by Aon Vest Holdings, authorized by Global Travel Infrastructure Consortium, name Donovan Raye, status majority control and investor, Orionis Aviation Group." Marla said nothing. Color drained slightly from her face. Behind her, the cabin door was still open. Donovan didn't say a word. He didn't have to. Marla's hand trembled slightly as she passed the card back. He tucked it away, slowly, deliberately. "You may wish to step off this plane," he said softly. "Before pushback, I'll handle things from here." And for the first time, Marla Jennings had no words. She turned and walked off the plane. The pilot followed 10 seconds later, and the plane never left the gate. The cabin was silent, not the kind of silence that comes with comfort, but the thick, unbreathable kind that follows a seismic shift. Donovan remained seated in 1A, the corners of his mouth still and unreadable. He hadn't blinked in what felt like minutes. Marla Jennings was gone. The pilot had followed her, his gait brisk and eyes low. The crew hadn't announced anything. No explanations, no apologies, just absence. Passengers looked around nervously. Some whispered behind books and newspapers. Others clutched phones beneath tray tables. One man in row 2 whispered, "I think that was the pilot. Did he just walk off?" But no one said anything to Donovan. No one asked him what happened. No one dared. Donovan leaned back, exhaled slowly through his nose, and closed his eyes not to rest, but to remember. He wasn't thinking about Marla, or even the threat of being forced off. He was thinking about the first time he sat behind a curtain like this. He was 16. It was a school trip to Washington, D.C., and because the program had extra funding that year, they flew commercial, economy, of course, back near the restrooms. He remembered seeing the curtain drawn tight between first and coach. It fascinated him not because of the amenities, but because of the permission it represented. On one side, warm towels, real glasses, nods of recognition. On the other side, indifference, plastic trays, and stares that lingered too long. At 16, he had made himself a quiet promise. Someday, he would walk through that curtain without apology, without fear. He kept that promise 1,000 times over. But today, the curtain had closed again, not with fabric, with something deeper, something that couldn't be pulled back so easily. Kara returned, her eyes softer now, more watchful. "Mr. Raye," she began, her voice low and measured. "Captain Reeves has disembarked. He stated he's not flying under threat of insubordination." Donovan turned to her. She didn't flinch. "The co-pilot," he asked, "also left," she said quietly. "He refused to fly without the captain." Donovan nodded once, not out of surprise, out of understanding. "Who's currently in charge of this aircraft?" he asked. Kara glanced to the galley, where another flight attendant stood frozen mid-task. "Well, technically, until we're in the air, it's still a gateside matter, but since we're sealed and no one else is at the jet bridge, I suppose it's you, sir." Donovan looked at her. It was the first time since takeoff preparations began that someone had said something without agenda, without performance. He appreciated it more than she realized. "Thank you, Kara," he said softly. Her posture eased slightly. "Would you like me to address the cabin?" "No," he replied. "Not yet." In row 5, a boy named Jalen Knox opened his live stream again, speaking in hushed excitement into the camera. "Y'all, this is wild. The CEO just sat the flight crew down like it was a board meeting. I'm telling you, this is next-level billionaire energy. They didn't even argue. They just left." Donovan heard the voice faintly, but didn't react. Instead, he looked forward toward the cockpit. For a long while, he didn't move, until he heard a sound he wasn't expecting. The shuffle of footsteps coming up the aisle from economy. Soft, slow, and familiar. He turned. His mother was standing just beyond the first-class curtain, a stewardess behind her looking confused. Evelyn Raye. Her gray coat was buttoned unevenly. Her purse dangled from one wrist, and in her other hand, she held a Ziploc bag with medicine bottles rattling gently inside. "Donovan," she said quietly. He stood, instantly. "Mom, I saw the pilot leave. Is everything okay?" Her voice wasn't worried, not yet, but he could tell she already knew something wasn't right. Her instincts were too sharp. Donovan offered his arm. "Come sit here for a moment." She hesitated. "I'm in 32E. Honey, that's okay. Please." It wasn't just a request. It was protection, a shield he had wanted to give her his whole life. Evelyn moved forward and lowered herself slowly into seat 1B. She looked around the cabin, then back at her son. "What happened?" He sat beside her and for a moment just looked at her face. "Someone mistook my seat," he said carefully. She raised an eyebrow. Again. She didn't speak for a moment. Then she placed her hand gently over his. "You're still carrying it, aren't you?" He looked at her, puzzled. "The weight," she clarified. "That tired ache, that bone-deep, heavy kind that comes when you spend your life proving what shouldn't need proving." Donovan didn't answer. He didn't need to. Evelyn smiled faintly. "You always tried to protect me from that, but you can't hide pain like that forever. It finds its way out." He nodded slowly. "That's why I asked you to fly with me today," he said. "I wanted you to see what we built, what you helped build." "I have," she said, looking around, "but I also see what still needs to change." Silence stretched again. Then Evelyn sat up straighter. "Now, Who do I need to talk to? Donovan chuckled for the first time that day. No one right now. Just then, the cabin door reopened. A man in uniform entered, but not a pilot, not a crew member. This man wore a blazer with an Orionis insignia and a headset. Ground Director Gate Operations. He scanned the cabin until his eyes locked with Donovan. "Mr. Raye?" he asked. Donovan rose. "Yes." "My name is Victor Hayes, Director of Ground Operations. We've been informed of an incident aboard the flight. I've been sent to facilitate next steps." Donovan nodded. "Then, please notify your operations desk. Flight 306 is grounded until further notice." Hayes blinked. "Sir, you heard me. Until we've conducted a full review of today's events, including the removal of 2 senior crew members and the attempted displacement of a verified passenger, this aircraft will not leave the tarmac." Passengers behind them gasped. Hayes straightened. "With respect, sir, I'm not sure I have the authority." "You don't," Donovan said, voice still calm. "But I do." He reached into his jacket once more, presented the card again. Hayes took one look and stepped back. "I understand." Donovan turned to Kara. "Please inform the passengers there will be a delay. Be honest, no vague apologies. They deserve the truth." Kara nodded. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice was steady. "Yes, sir." Evelyn looked at her son, and for the first time in a long while, her eyes filled with something more than worry. Pride. She reached for his hand again. "Don't let them shrink you," she whispered. "Not now. Not ever." And Donovan knew. This curtain would not close again. The cabin had gone from a simmer to something close to stillness, and still. The oxygen in the air felt different. Not thinner, exactly, but sharpened, as if every breath carried weight. Kara stood in front of the cabin with a calm she wasn't sure she could maintain, holding the intercom microphone with both hands like it might fly away if she didn't grip it tight. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice level, "this is your lead flight attendant speaking. There has been a delay. Our flight is currently grounded by executive decision. We apologize for the inconvenience, and we will keep you updated with real-time information. We appreciate your patience." She paused, then added, "If any passengers need medical attention or access to prescription medication, please notify us immediately." She glanced at Donovan as she spoke, her eyes lingering a little longer than necessary. She had chosen those final words for him. Donovan gave her a small nod of thanks, but said nothing. His mother sat beside him now, quietly unscrewing the lid of her water bottle and placing her medication bottles in a neat row on her tray. From several rows back, Jalen Knox was still recording, but his tone had changed, less amused, more awestruck. "Y'all, this man just grounded a plane, like, legally. I don't think people understand he literally just shut down this flight." That was the ground director. He walked away, nobody even argued. His voice cracked slightly, the reality starting to settle in. And look, that's his mom sitting next to him. She just pulled out her pills. Man, this is real life. Donovan could hear the stream but didn't react. Not outwardly. Inside, though, his chest tightened. He had lived his entire adult life trying to earn invisibility, not in the sense of hiding, but in the sense of being beyond category, beyond suspicion, beyond stereotype. He wore tailored navy suits with subtle lapels, never bright, never threatening. He spoke in measured tones, never raised his voice, He knew how to tilt his head when walking past security, how to smile just enough to seem agreeable, but not too much to seem unhinged. But all of that careful calibration was useless in the face of what had just happened. And now, there was a camera lens recording all of it, going viral, probably. He thought of his team back at Aon Vest. He thought of Marcus, his chief legal officer, who would already be on his third espresso shot pacing around their D.C. office. He thought of his assistant, Hannah, who was likely fielding a dozen calls from news outlets. He could almost hear her calm voice on speaker. "We are aware of the situation and will be issuing a statement shortly. Thank you." And still, all he could feel was that 16-year-old version of himself, the one who had once stood outside a locked classroom door while the others inside laughed. That memory never faded. It just buried itself under achievement. Now, it was clawing its way back up. Across the aisle, a woman spoke up. Her name was Mrs. Delphine Carter, middle-aged, white, librarian glasses perched on the tip of her nose. "Excuse me," she called, waving her hand toward Kara. "Can we at least know what this is about? I mean, I paid full fare for this seat. Some of us have places to be." Kara glanced at Donovan. Donovan didn't move. Evelyn spoke instead. "My son was removed from his seat," she said gently, not unkindly. Mrs. Carter narrowed her eyes. "Removed? He's sitting right there." Evelyn smiled. "Patient. He wasn't allowed to sit here at first. He was asked to move, repeatedly, even after presenting his ticket, even after showing ID. He was mistaken for someone who didn't belong." Mrs. Carter blinked. "Well, that's unfortunate. But surely we don't need to cancel the entire flight over a misunderstanding." Donovan finally turned. "There's a difference between a misunderstanding and a pattern," he said, voice calm but unyielding. "This isn't the first time, not even the 10th. It's a pattern of dehumanization masked as policy." A man behind Mrs. Carter murmured, "Amen." And just like that, the silence cracked. Another passenger, a Latina woman holding a toddler, raised her hand. "I saw what happened. I was in the terminal earlier. That woman, Marla, she was rude from the moment he walked in, kept talking over him, kept checking his ID like it was fake." More voices joined, some hesitant, some loud. A man in a military jacket said, "I've been flying for 30 years. I've seen this play out before. Always the same look, the same assumption." Another woman whispered, "They tried to move him out of first class, just like they tried to move my daughter last year." The mood shifted. Suddenly, it wasn't just about Donovan. It wasn't just about this flight. It was about all of it. The curtain, the stares, the polite phrases that hid sharp edges. A reckoning had begun quiet, but irreversible. Donovan stood, not to make a speech, but because he felt a duty. He walked toward the front of the cabin and turned to face everyone. "I didn't come here to make a scene," he said. "I came here to fly with my mother, but something happened. And it's not the first time, and I'm not the first person." He looked down briefly, gathering himself. When people talk about dignity, they often imagine grand gestures, but real dignity is quiet. It's choosing not to explain yourself again. It's staying seated when someone tells you to stand. It's breathing through humiliation because you've lived through worse. He paused. "I grounded this plane today because I've reached the limit, not just for me, for every mother who gets ignored, every teen who gets searched, Every father who gets called sir until he stands up for himself, and then it's sir with quotation marks. People were listening now. No phones out, no coughing, no overhead fans, just attention. And let me be clear, I'm not doing this to punish, I'm doing this to reset, to ask what kind of culture do we want to build at 30,000 feet? Do we want skies that are just friendly for some? Someone in the back clapped once, then again, it spread, a small, cautious ripple of hands meeting palms in defiance of silence. Donovan sat down again, his hands slightly shaking, though no one could see it. Evelyn placed her hand over his. "You spoke," she said simply. "Now let's see who listens." And at that moment, thousands of feet below, Marcus, the chief legal officer, was already writing a memo titled Airline Position on Airline Equity, Passenger Rights, and Systemic Bias in Air Travel. He didn't know it yet, but that live stream was about to cross 7 million views. News outlets would replay that small speech again and again, calling it the Aisle Address. Donovan hadn't planned to start a movement, but movements rarely ask permission. They begin where silence ends. When Kara returned to the front galley, she looked different. Not in appearance, but in posture. She had stood for nearly 2 hours in an emotional hurricane, trying to balance protocol with conscience. Now, her hands were clasped tightly in front of her waist, her chin lifted just slightly higher. The cabin door opened quietly with a hiss of pressurized air. A sharp breeze of conditioned ground air rushed through. In stepped 3 men in dark navy uniforms. 2 wore badges. The third wore authority. "Flight 392, the lead officer asked flatly. Scanning the cabin, Kara stepped forward. "Yes, sir. I'm the lead flight attendant. Kara Mitchell," the man nodded. "Captain Alan Reed, FAA Response Unit. We've been briefed. Where is the passenger who issued the executive ground order?" The moment those words left his mouth, the temperature shifted again. Passengers looked up from their phones. Some lowered their tray tables. Some sat back, as if bracing for impact. Donovan rose from his seat without a word. "I'm Donovan Raye, Chairman and CEO of Aonvest Holdings. My override was executed under Title 49, subsection 46106, confirmed by Ground Director Victor Hayes. As witnessed by your internal radio system." Captain Reed narrowed his eyes. "Not hostile, just calculating. I've seen the footage, the live stream. I'm not here to dispute your authority, Mr. Raye. But I need to know your intention. The flight is grounded. The crew is half panicked. Your name is trending with 15 million hits, and the entire country's watching. So, what now?" Donovan gestured for the man to follow. They stepped just behind the service curtain into the galley, where the conversation felt less like a confrontation and more like a meeting between 2 men who understood power. Donovan folded his hands. "I don't want to punish the passengers, but I do intend to halt this flight, permanently, and I intend to make it the last time this crew boards under their current protocols. That includes the captain, co-pilot, and ground supervisor who enabled the removal attempt. I want this incident documented, escalated, and publicly reviewed." Reed considered his words. "You know what you're asking isn't simple." Donovan didn't flinch. "I didn't ground this flight for simplicity." Reed paused, then quietly asked, "How far are you willing to take this?" Donovan looked him in the eye. "To the ceiling. And if that fails, through it." From the other side of the curtain, voices stirred. Passengers had caught the tone of authority without needing to hear words. Meanwhile, in seat 1B. Evelyn Raye closed her eyes. She had not spoken again since Donovan's speech. Her hand rested gently on the pill bottle she hadn't yet opened, but in her chest, her heart beat like a steady metronome. For the first time in a long time, she felt like her son wasn't carrying his burden alone. The captain of the plane, an older man named Carl Stenwick, finally exited the cockpit. He had been briefed mid-call by corporate but delayed making any visible move. Now, under FAA eyes. He approached Donovan with stiff shoulders. "Mr. Raye," he began. "I was unaware of the issue when boarding began. I take responsibility for not intervening sooner, but I'd like to offer you a seat in my cockpit jump seat for the remainder of the flight. Should you reconsider?" Donovan blinked once. Slowly. "You're offering me a spare seat after I was removed from my purchased one?" he asked, voice calm, even. "With all due respect, Captain, what you just offered is the equivalent of giving a guest your garage after locking them out of your home." Carl's face stiffened. Donovan continued, "You had a chance to lead. You chose to wait." That hit hard. Before the captain could respond, Kara approached again. "Sir," she said, addressing Donovan, "there's a call from Aon Vest on the ground line. Your general counsel is on hold." Donovan stepped into the galley, lifted the secure phone, and waited. Marcus Benton's voice came through, clear and charged. "We've run the legal overlays. You're protected, and you're not alone. 8 of our partner companies are watching. They want to back a formal motion through the Transportation Equity Board. But Donovan, if you want this to mean something, don't just shut down a plane. Shut down the myth that these things are one-off events." Donovan closed his eyes. His voice softened. What happens when a man speaks softly for 20 years, and no one listens? There was a pause on the other end. Then Marcus said, "Then maybe it's time he lets the silence fall behind him." Back in the cabin, Jalen Knox, still live streaming, turned the camera to himself. "This man, y'all, this black man right here just told the FAA what was going to happen, and they listened. I've never seen anything like this. And his mom, she's been quiet this whole time, just watching. But I'm telling you, she's the anchor. You can see it. She's why he's this strong." A woman seated behind Evelyn leaned forward. "Excuse me," she said softly. "Is he your only child?" Evelyn smiled gently. "My only son," she replied, "but not my only hope." In that moment, a young flight attendant barely out of training, named Lynn Tran, stepped forward with a tray of water bottles. She paused beside Donovan, hesitant. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. I saw what happened, but I didn't know if I could speak. I'm new, still probationary." Donovan met her eyes. "You just did," he said. And with that, something cracked not loudly, but quietly, beautifully. One crew member stepping forward, one truth acknowledged. It wasn't revolution, not yet, but it was the start of something that couldn't be reversed. Back at the front of the plane, Captain Reed finally lifted his comms unit. "Flight 392 FAA Command," he said. "We're executing a full passenger deboard under Clause 4A Executive Grounds. This aircraft will remain non-operational until further notice. Prepare to offload." Gasps rippled across the plane. Donovan took one last look at the cabin, at the people who had watched him not just stand up, but stay standing. He walked over to his mother. "Come on, Ma, let's walk." She reached for his hand, and together they stepped off the aircraft not in defeat, but in declaration. They would not be erased. They would not be seated silently. Not anymore. The terminal at Dallas-Fort Worth was unusually still. A few murmurs echoed through the wide glass halls. Passengers from Flight 392 filed in slowly, like survivors of something unspoken. No one argued, no one shouted. They just moved quiet, thoughtful, uncertain. Donovan Raye and his mother walked side by side down Concourse D, flanked loosely by FAA staff and trailing whispers. Phones were still filming. Security cameras caught every step, somewhere above them. News anchors were already debating what had happened. Not the facts, those were clear, but the implications, the weight. Evelyn walked slower now, her breathing steady but shallow. Donovan turned his head slightly and offered her his arm. "I'm okay," she whispered. "I know." He replied, "But let me walk with you anyway." They reached gate D-27 where a row of chairs faced the now closed jet bridge. A few passengers sat numbly, watching their phones or gazing at the tarmac like it might offer some cosmic explanation. One of the gate agents, a young black woman named Sonia Wright, stood at the counter, visibly shaken. She had watched everything unfold on the internal comms, helpless to intervene. Now, she straightened her jacket and stepped toward Donovan with a strange mix of sorrow and admiration. "I just wanted to say," she began, voice hushed, "what you did, it mattered." Donovan nodded slightly. "Thank you," she hesitated, "and I'm sorry. On behalf of everyone who didn't say anything when they should have." He studied her face. "You just did." A quiet smile passed between them. From a nearby table, Jalen Knox adjusted his camera setup. The live stream hadn't stopped. If anything, it had grown nearly 1.2 million viewers now. He turned the lens toward Donovan as he sat beside his mother, gently wrapping his jacket around her shoulders. Jalen lowered his voice, more narrator than showman now. "You're watching history, folks. Not a protest, not a spectacle, just a man and his mama refusing to be invisible, and the airline. They haven't said a word, not one. His words were true. Orionis Air had gone silent. Inside the airline's regional operations hub, chaos was unfolding behind frosted glass. Executives scrambled to spin a response. Public relations advisors were being woken up on 3 continents. Investors were calling, some threatening to pull, others quietly applauding. And then came the message. A short, direct email from Donovan's executive assistant to the Orionis board. Subject immediate escalation notice. Contract termination body. In light of today's discriminatory incident aboard Orionis Flight 392, Mr. Donovan Raye will be activating Clause 11.4 of the Aon Vest Holdings Vendor Integrity Agreement. Effective immediately. All strategic investments, co-marketing initiatives, and operations partnerships between Aon Vest Holdings and Orionis Air are suspended pending federal review and public accountability. No theatrics, no hashtags, just a quiet detonation sent directly to the heart of a billion-dollar airline. Back at the terminal, Evelyn closed her eyes and leaned gently against her son's shoulder. "You always did carry your storms in silence," she said softly. Donovan didn't respond for a long moment. When he did, his voice was low. "Do you think I was wrong?" "Ma," she considered that carefully. "I think you were tired. Not just today, for years. Tired of whispering dignity and waiting for people to listen. And when the moment came, you didn't raise your voice. You raised the stakes. A pause. That's not wrong. That's history. Meanwhile, a group of off-duty pilots had gathered near Gate D-24. They were watching the footage together, huddled around one phone, then another. One of them, Captain Lila Monroe, stared in disbelief. "I've flown 32 years," she said quietly, "and I've never seen a flight grounded by a passenger's authority and then sanctioned like this. Not for something that had nothing to do with safety. Not technically." Another pilot, younger, leaned in. "It did have to do with safety. His mother's, ours. Dignity is a safety issue. We've just never had the guts to write it into the flight manual." Lila looked across the terminal at Donovan. "What's his name again?" "Donovan Raye." Someone whispered. The name would echo long after that day, in a quiet, waiting area near baggage claim. Kara Mitchell sat alone with her hands trembling in her lap. Her flight uniform felt like a weight now. She had done nothing illegal, that much she knew, but she hadn't done enough, not when it counted. Her personal phone buzzed, a text from her teenage daughter. "Mom, is that you in the video? Did you say anything? Did you help him?" The question hit her like a stone. She hadn't said anything. She hadn't helped. She'd followed protocol, smiled politely, deferred to authority. Now, her daughter, the same daughter she'd taught to stand up for herself, was asking the one question she couldn't answer. Kara stood, walked toward the terminal windows, and stared out at the grounded plane. For a moment, she imagined what would have happened if she had stopped the removal. If she had said, "He stays." If she had spoken not as an employee, but as a human being. She closed her eyes and whispered under her breath, "Next time, I will." Inside a conference room at Aon Vest headquarters, Marcus Benton opened the emergency response binder. His legal team sat around him, eyes sharp, voices low. The mood wasn't vengeance, it was preparation. "Donovan's not trying to bankrupt an airline," Marcus said firmly. "He's trying to rebuild a system from the inside out, and we are not backing down. Not until dignity is written into every operational policy." One of the junior counsels asked, "But if we do this, if we go public, they'll accuse him of weaponizing influence." Marcus looked up. "He's not weaponizing anything. He's restoring balance, and if that scares them, maybe they should ask why they were so comfortable when it was broken." Back in the terminal, Jalen Knox's live stream neared its 5th hour, but the numbers hadn't dropped, if anything. They kept rising. People were sharing the story not because it was sensational, but because it was true. He turned his phone to Donovan and asked the question the world was waiting on. "What do you want people to remember about this moment, Mr.?" Ray Donovan didn't answer right away. He looked around at the terminal, the grounded plane, the exhausted passengers, the silent airline reps hiding inside offices. Then he turned to the camera. That every system built by silence eventually meets a voice it can't ignore. And with that, he stood up. The reckoning had begun. The conference room on the 43rd floor of Aon Vest Holdings headquarters was silent. The skyline of Chicago stretched behind the floor-to-ceiling windows like an oil painting, blue, gray, and trembling under the weight of the evening light. Donovan Raye sat at the head of the long walnut table, one hand resting on his mother's scarf that he hadn't let go of since the flight. His other hand moved slowly across the surface of his tablet, reviewing every frame of the live stream, every comment, every reposted moment that now had a life of its own. Across from him sat Marcus Benton, his chief legal strategist, already preparing for what he called Phase 2. But tonight wasn't about retaliation. Tonight was about decision. The screen at the far end of the room lit up with the faces of board members, investors, compliance officers, human rights consultants, and at least one FAA liaison. No greetings, no small talk, just a unified gravity that settled over the call like storm clouds before thunder. Donovan looked around the room, then spoke softly. "We are not here to punish. We are here to decide what kind of world we're willing to fund." A woman in her 60s appeared on the screen. Miriam Kale, veteran investor, survivor of the civil rights era, and a quiet force within the board. "Donovan," she said, her voice lined with a quiet tremor, "before we vote, I want to ask you plainly, what do you want to happen to Orionis Air?" Donovan paused. He didn't flinch. He didn't posture. "I want them grounded," he said. "Not just their planes, their culture, their hierarchy, their definition of professionalism. I want a full audit of every discriminatory incident they've swept under the rug. I want mandatory equity retraining across their executive board and cabin crew. And until that happens, I want them suspended from every Aon Vest-funded airport lease, media deal, and private capital stream we influence." Silence. Then a low whistle from one of the younger partners. Marcus leaned forward. He's not pulling this out of emotion. He's pulling this from the very contract they begged us to co-sign last year. Vendor Clause 11.4. Breach of dignity. That's their signature, not ours. A compliance officer raised his hand. "Donovan, what happened to you and your mother was horrific. I say this with full support, but this action will make enemies. You know that, right?" Donovan looked up, his gaze calm. So did Rosa Parks. The room went still. From his seat, Marcus tapped a button. A PDF filled the screen, an internal HR document from Orionis dated March 2024. A formal complaint from a passenger named Amira Jennings, who had reported being called excess baggage by a flight attendant after boarding with her service dog. The complaint had been buried, marked non-actionable. "This isn't just about Donovan," Marcus said. "This is about a pattern. They haven't been grounded before because nobody with power has ever insisted they land." Another board member, Hudson Fielding, tried to interject. Look, that flight crew wasn't necessarily acting with malice. They made a judgment call. It might have been unconscious bias. We can't destroy a company over a misunderstanding." Donovan turned toward the screen. "My mother was bruised, emotionally, physically. She was told to know her place by a junior flight attendant who assumed she couldn't possibly belong where she was seated. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a worldview." Hudson fumbled. "Still, it's drastic, a total shutdown." Miriam's voice cut in like a piano chord. "You think drastic is grounding a plane? I think drastic is watching an 81-year-old black woman be shamed on camera while the rest of the crew stood silent." No one spoke for a while. Then came the motion. Miriam cleared her throat. "I move that we enforce Clause 11.4 of the Aon Vest Holdings Vendor Integrity Agreement, effective immediately. All operations and business ties with Orionis Air are to be suspended, and a public statement issued by 9 a.m. EST. The vote was unanimous, 12-0. It was done." After the call ended, Donovan leaned back in his chair. His muscles didn't relax. They simply recalibrated, like a building learning to bear the weight of a new rooftop. Marcus turned to him. "You okay?" Donovan nodded slowly. "I'm thinking about the gate agent, Sonia." "Yeah," Donovan said. She looked scared to speak, but she still came forward. She reminded me of how it starts, not with policies, with people. He stood and walked to the window. Outside, the city lights had begun to pulse softly. He thought about his mother, now resting quietly in her guest suite with warm tea and soft jazz playing. She'd said she was proud of him before she went to bed. But Donovan felt something else beneath that pride, a fatigue, a question he couldn't shake. He whispered it aloud now, to the glass, to the dark. How many more times does this have to happen before silence becomes complicity? He didn't expect an answer. But across the city, on social media feeds, news banners, and personal timelines, something was shifting. For the first time, the story of a black CEO being denied his seat wasn't ending in a quiet apology or a legal settlement. It was ending in consequences, structural ones. Back in Dallas, the news had broken. Gate D27 was now swarmed with press, passengers, and policy activists, and Sonia Wright stood quietly behind the counter, answering questions, not as a company spokesperson, but as a witness. They didn't just take his seat, she told one reporter. They took her dignity, and the difference this time is they did it in front of a man who wasn't afraid to stop the whole flight to get it back. Her voice cracked, but we all saw it, and I think we all asked ourselves, would I have stood up too? The reporter asked her name again. Sonia Wright, and what's your role? She looked down at her badge, then slowly took it off. I was a gate agent, she said, then handed the badge to the reporter. Now, I think I'm something else. The message came at 6:14 a.m. Eastern Time. It was short, sterile, and perfectly timed for the morning press cycle. Orionis Air released an official statement. We sincerely regret the unfortunate misunderstanding involving Mr. Donovan Raye and his guest on Flight 451. Orionis Air does not tolerate discrimination in any form. We are investigating the incident thoroughly and have placed the involved crew members on administrative leave. We are committed to restoring trust. No names, no admission of wrongdoing, no apology to Evelyn Raye, whose bruises were still visible beneath her silk collar. Donovan read it while standing in the kitchen of his high-rise apartment, steam curling from his untouched cup of coffee. He didn't flinch, he didn't laugh. He simply set the phone down and walked over to the window, watching the city hum beneath the early morning haze. His mother appeared in the doorway a moment later, wrapped in her robe, hair pinned back. She moved slower now, her joints still stiff from the fall, but her eyes, deep brown and weathered with grace, held steady. You read it? She asked gently. I did. Evelyn crossed the room and stood beside him. The silence between them was warm but stretched thin, as though holding a truth neither of them wanted to say first. They said it was a misunderstanding, Donovan said, his voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn gave a quiet laugh. Tired and brittle. That word, she said. Misunderstanding. It's the cleanest lie in the English language. Donovan turned to her, studying her face. He had seen her survive grief, cancer, 2 layoffs, and the slow erasure of her generation's voice. But nothing had made him feel as helpless as watching her be humiliated, dismissed as a fraud in the very seat he'd gifted her with pride. I should have done more, he said. You did what mattered, she answered, but he wasn't sure he believed it. That afternoon, he received a call from Dr. Natalie Ferraes, the newly appointed interim CEO of Orionis Air. Her voice was calm, professional, and laced with urgency. "Mr. Raye, I'm reaching out personally," she began, "to express regret. I just joined this role, but I take full accountability. I want to meet face to face." Donovan stared at the phone, unmoving. Then he asked, "Did you see the video?" "Yes." "Did you see the way the flight attendant smirked when she said people like her?" There was a pause on the line. Then, quietly, "I did." "Then you understand this conversation isn't about repairing trust. It's about whether you deserve it in the first place." He ended the call before she could respond. Hours later, as headlines swirled Orionis Air under fire. Black CEO grounds airline contract. Elder abuse on first-class row. Donovan received a package at his door. It wasn't from Orionis PR, it was from Sonia Wright. Inside was a simple note on lined paper I've handed in my badge. I'll testify if needed. But more than anything, I want to thank you, because for the first time in 12 years, I didn't stay silent. Beneath the note was the blue lanyard she'd worn that day, the same one that had trembled in her hand when she'd tried to defend Evelyn. Donovan held it in his palm for a long time, thinking of all the people who'd seen that moment and stayed quiet, not because they agreed, but because the system had trained them to flinch at truth. The lanyard now sat beside Evelyn's scarf on his desk. 2 artifacts, 2 symbols, one of honor, one of harm. By evening, Donovan's name trended worldwide, not as a CEO, not as a billionaire, but as a son who refused to let his mother be erased. He received an invitation to appear on Night Talk, a primetime current affairs show known for its blunt, often volatile political discourse. He declined. Instead, he recorded a short video from his living room. No production, no script, just him and the city light. "My name is Donovan Raye," he said. "I'm not here to demand an apology. I'm here to remind you that dignity isn't a privilege to be granted. It's a birthright." He continued, his voice calm but weighted. "When my mother was told she didn't belong in first class, they weren't questioning her seat. They were questioning her humanity, and that's a question we can no longer allow to go unanswered." He ended with a promise. "This isn't the end of the conversation. It's the beginning of an industry reset, one that will not ask politely for change, but enforce it." The video went viral in under 4 hours. News anchors called it presidential. Historians called it generational. Civil rights advocates called it a pivot. But Evelyn Raye, watching from the kitchen table, simply called it my boy telling the truth. She wiped a tear away and whispered, "Your father would have been proud." That night, Donovan sat alone on the balcony, the sky dusted with stars. He scrolled through messages from strangers, single mothers, retired teachers, immigrant workers, black grandfathers, and even a few flight attendants who had quietly reached out to say, "We saw it. We're sorry. We want to help." He wrote back to many of them, not as a CEO, not as a campaigner, but as a witness. He knew the apology from Orionis had come too late, too empty, too curated. It wasn't made for his mother. It was made for headlines. But in the silence of that night, Donovan realized something larger was shifting. The apology didn't matter. The reckoning had already begun. And this time, it had a face, not of a victim, but of a leader who wouldn't let silence win. It was supposed to be a routine morning departure from Dallas-Fort Worth. Flight 718 bound for Vancouver was fully boarded, catering loaded, pre-flight checks complete. The captain's voice came over the intercom with the usual charm, promising calm skies and smooth travel, but 37 minutes past scheduled takeoff. The doors still hadn't closed. The passengers grew restless. First came the murmurs, then the questions. A toddler cried in 14C. An elderly man removed his headphones and looked toward the galley. Confused, in the front, a woman in 2A tapped her watch and muttered, "This is ridiculous." No announcement came. In the cockpit, however, the silence was anything but ordinary. Captain Lydia Krause, a seasoned Orionis pilot with 30 years in the air, was locked in quiet conversation with two uniformed ground control officers. One held a sealed envelope marked "Internal Mandate Priority Override." Lydia read the letter once, then twice. She looked up slowly, her face unreadable. "Is this confirmed?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am. Effective immediately." Behind her, the first officer watched her hands go still. Back in the terminal, 3 other gates had also stalled. Gate agents gathered around screens showing internal dispatch alerts that blinked and read, "All Orionis Air Flights suspended Executive Directive 449A initiated in Chicago, in Newark, in Seattle, across the country. Jetways froze. Airplanes full of passengers were told to disembark without explanation." At LAX, a teenage girl in a flight attendant uniform burst into tears behind the check-in counter. She'd been 2 days from earning her full wings. Donovan Raye stood in a quiet control room with full view of the entire operation. Screens flickered with real-time updates, dispatch logs, flight telemetry, and internal messaging apps all reflected the same chilling phrase, "Operation Ground Line Engaged." To the public, it looked like a system outage. To insiders, it was a controlled shutdown unlike anything Orionis or any major airline had ever witnessed. By 11:00 a.m., news outlets were scrambling. CNN went live. Breaking Orionis grounds, all flights, technical issue or corporate crisis. In the war room, Donovan sat at the head of a long glass table surrounded by his legal team, ethics officers, and newly assembled advisory board. His mother's scarf, still faintly stained from that day, was folded neatly in his lap. "This isn't revenge," he said, voice calm but unshakable. "It's reckoning." One of the younger advisors, a woman named Kayla Jennings, leaned forward. "Donovan, grounding an entire fleet. This is billions of dollars at stake. Stockholders are already panicking." "I understand," he said. "But we need to decide what we value more. Revenue or a system where someone like my mother doesn't get thrown to the floor and called a liar for having brown skin and a boarding pass." The room fell into a heavy silence. Then Kayla nodded. "Then we start the rebuild," she said quietly, "from the inside out." Donovan tapped the table twice and stood. "Good," he said, "because the plane never took off, and neither will our conscience." By early afternoon, passengers stranded in airports across the country were offered hotel vouchers and generic apologies. Still, many weren't angry. Some began watching the viral clip of Evelyn Raye being pulled from her seat. More began to understand. In Houston, an airport janitor paused by the gate monitors and whispered to a coworker, "They're doing it for her." A ripple of awareness swept through the travel industry. Across social media, a trending tag emerged, "Dear the plane that didn't fly by evening." Donovan received a message from a name he hadn't seen in 20 years. Lionel Green, his high school principal. "You've done more with one order than most do with a whole career." You grounded planes to lift people?" Donovan smiled for the first time that day, but back in the executive tower at Orionis, Dr. Natalie Ferre was fighting to stay afloat. Her inbox had collapsed. Investors were demanding explanations, but she knew deep down that this wasn't a collapse, it was a correction. She watched the internal footage again. Evelyn Raye, stunned, trying to explain her name on the boarding pass. The cold, dismissive tone from the flight lead, the eye rolls, the smirk. It wasn't just racial bias, it was institutional arrogance, and she hadn't stopped it in time. That evening, she called Donovan one last time. He answered, unexpectedly. "You win," she said softly. "This isn't about winning," he replied. "It's about rebuilding what should have never been broken." There was a long pause. "Then, what happens next?" she asked. Donovan's voice didn't waver. "We ground the culture, and we clear the skies." Later that night, as Donovan sat by the window in his home, he looked up at the sky and remembered what his mother had said when she was younger. Every plane has to touch ground eventually. But how it lands, that's what defines the pilot. He whispered the words aloud, as if sending them out into the darkness. He had grounded a fleet, but something far greater had taken flight. The next morning, sunlight streamed across Donovan Raye's dining room table, but his coffee had gone cold. He hadn't touched it. He was still staring at the stack of internal files sent by Orionis's ethics division overnight. Documents, testimonies, past complaints, patterns. The weight of it sat heavy in his chest. 3 years of ignored warnings, he murmured to himself. 3 years of passengers like my mother. One file stood out. It belonged to Malik Harris, a schoolteacher from Atlanta, who had filed a complaint 2 years ago about being removed from a flight after a white couple felt uncomfortable sitting next to him. Malik had bought a first-class ticket. The couple had not, yet he was the one escorted off. No follow-up, no apology, no action. Donovan closed the folder, exhaled slowly, and stood. He walked to the window and stared down at the street. People passed by, kids with backpacks, women walking dogs, a young man on a skateboard humming something beneath his breath. The world moved on, but Donovan knew he couldn't. He opened his laptop and called an emergency meeting. No press, no PR filters, just the decision-makers. When the screen filled with 12 faces, he spoke plainly. "We're not rebooting flights until we fix this, not just the optics, the culture." A silence followed, long and tense. Finally, Kayla Jennings broke it. "How do you want to start?" Donovan nodded. "With the crews, every staffer, pilot, and customer-facing employee must pass through a new equity and dignity training program. Not a video, not a checkbox, a real, live, peer-led system." One of the VPs, an older man named Tom Griggs, frowned. "That's not sustainable. We'd lose half the senior staff. Then we start with the half who should stay," Donovan said calmly. Kayla smiled faintly. "What about passengers?" Donovan tapped his pen against the table twice, thinking, "We create a new protocol, Code D, D for dignity. Any passenger who witnesses discrimination, whether against themselves or others, can activate the code through a QR scan on their seatback screen. It instantly flags a human response team, not a bot, and that flag becomes public after review. No hiding misconduct behind bureaucracy." Tom sighed again. "That's gonna be messy." "So was my mother's face hitting the floor," Donovan replied, his voice sharp for the first time. This isn't about comfort anymore. It's about accountability." The call ended with quiet agreement. Donovan leaned back in his chair, drained but resolute. That afternoon, he visited a facility in downtown Los Angeles where many Orionis staff had gathered for clarity and, in truth, comfort. The news had shaken them. Some feared layoffs. Others felt shame. A few were angry. He stood on a small stage in a plain white shirt and no title on his name tag. "My name is Donovan Raye," he began, "and I'm not here as your boss. I'm here as Evelyn Raye's son, and she's why we're standing in this room today." There was a hush. A few staff members exchanged glances. Some had seen the video. Others had lived similar moments on quieter days. He continued, "Some of you are angry that we grounded the flights. Some of you are confused. Some of you are afraid. I understand all of that, but I need you to understand something too. It is no longer acceptable for our aircraft to fly if a single soul on board is treated like they don't belong. Not by accident, not by policy, not by silence." He paused, letting the words breathe. "If that means we delay departures, so be it. If that means we rebuild the airline from the bolts up, we do it. But make no mistake, Orionis will no longer trade comfort for complicity." A young woman in the front row, her name tag read L. Sanchez, raised her hand. "Sir," she said gently, "how do we know it won't just fade like every other initiative that came and went?" Donovan smiled, not as a gesture of reassurance, but of respect. Because this time, it cost us everything. Because this time, the person who makes the final call won't look away. He stepped down from the stage as a quiet, affirming applause began to ripple across the room. Later that evening, Donovan sat across from Dr. Natalie Ferrez in her private office. Her resignation sat unsigned between them. "I failed you," she said, "and your mother. I let the structure rot from inside while we painted the outside gold." He nodded slowly. "I don't want your resignation. I want your help." Natalie looked up, startled. "You want me to stay?" "You built half this empire," he said. "Help me rebuild the other half. But this time, not with silence, with courage." She sat back, overwhelmed, but deeply moved. "I don't deserve that grace." Donovan met her eyes. "No, but you can earn it back." She picked up the paper and tore it in half. By midnight, every Orionis headquarters across the country received an internal email with the subject Operation Lift a New Sky. It laid out the plan, every employee retrained, every complaint re-reviewed. A dignity audit launched across all departments. A passenger dignity board including past victims was being formed to help shape the future. It was ambitious, expensive, risky, but for the first time in years, the airline's heart was beaten in rhythm with its promise, and somewhere in a small apartment in Southside Chicago, Malik Harris opened his email and read, "Dear Mr. Harris, we are sorry, we are listening, we are changing. If you're willing, we would be honored to have you join our Passenger Equity Council." Malik stared at the screen, unsure whether to laugh or cry. He did a bit of both. The new policies had barely settled when Flight 274 rolled toward Gate C3. The cabin crew, retrained and refreshed, moved with careful warmth. Loyalty badges now bore a small emblem, a raised fist inside a wing, symbolizing dignity in flight. Donovan Raye watched from first class as the passengers filed on. The engine's thrum was quieter than before, like a heartbeat cautious of its own strength. He settled into 1A with a measured exhale. Evelyn was in 1B, her eyes bright with anticipation. He had flown this route dozens of times, but tonight felt different. This flight was the launch of something larger than just a reopened schedule. It was the test of a promise that no passenger would ever be told they didn't belong here again. Kara Mitchell, now senior dignity officer, stood in the aisle, offering water and genuine smiles. When she reached Donovan, she spoke softly. "Everything is ready." He nodded. "Thank you." She moved on, and he glanced toward the rear. Seat 14A remained empty, reserved for a special guest. In 14A sat Malik Harris, the teacher who had been removed from his first-class seat 2 years ago. He had accepted Donovan's invitation to serve on the Passenger Equity Council. Tonight, he would witness the change firsthand. His presence was a living testament that accountability could heal wounds. When Malik rose to greet Donovan, the cabin felt electric yet tender. Malik's skin glowed under the cabin lights. He offered a handshake that turned into a nod of solidarity. "Thank you for having me," Malik said, voice low. "Thank you for joining us," Donovan replied. "You're part of the solution." Evelyn reached over to squeeze Malik's hand. "We're glad you came." The flight attendant paused to watch the scene. In that moment, every seatback screen displayed a brief note. "Welcome to a new era of flight. Respect belongs to all." The doors closed, the seatbelt sign chimed on, and the captain's voice came through with measured calm. This time, it wasn't just about safety, it was about dignity. As the plane taxied, passengers whispered to one another. Some recognized Malik from social media. Others saw his name on their updated boarding passes. Many simply felt the shift in atmosphere like stepping into a story rewritten in real time. Pushback began. The engines roared with intent. The plane lifted seamlessly into the dusk sky, in first class. Donovan let his gaze drift between the glowing horizon and the faces of his fellow passengers. Each person wore a look of cautious hope. He glanced at Malik, who leaned back in his seat and exhaled quietly. The flight attendant approached with menus that now included a dedication in honor of dignity. Every story matters. Donovan opened the menu and saw an added note from Kara. "Today, if you experience anything that doesn't honor your worth, please press the red dignity button on your armrest. A trained crew member will respond immediately." He felt a swell of pride. Real change had a simple trigger, one that now belonged to every passenger. The cabin lights dimmed for dinner service. Soft jazz played over the speakers. A pianist had been recorded in New Orleans for the inaugural flight. It lent warmth to the hum of the cabin. After dinner, Donovan turned to Malik. "How does it feel?" Malik smiled, then grew serious. "I had a recurring nightmare after that flight in Atlanta." He said, "I'd wake up strapped in a seat I couldn't occupy, like the world had locked me out of my own life." Donovan listened without interrupting. "My wife would shake me." Malik continued. She'd say, "You're safe. You're at home." But my mind was still on that plane. Donovan felt the weight of those words. They echoed memories too many carried in silence. "I want to thank you," Malik said, "for turning that nightmare into a dream I can share openly." Evelyn reached for Malik's hand. Tears glistened in her eyes. They settled into a quiet camaraderie. Several rows back, a young woman in business attire tapped the armrest. She pressed the red dignity button. Within seconds, Lynn Tran, the newly promoted dignity liaison, knelt beside her. can I help you?" Lynn asked. The woman hesitated. I just wanted to say thank you," she whispered. "I was pulled aside last flight for the same mistake. This button gave me the courage to speak up." Lynn smiled and offered a tissue. "Thank you for letting us know." Even the smallest gestures now carried weight, proof that accountability could bloom in simple acknowledgement. Mid-flight, an announcement came. "Ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate your participation in making Orionis Air a safer and more respectful space for all travelers. We invite you to share feedback through the in-seat portal or with our team directly. Thank you for joining us on this historic flight." The applause that followed was soft and heartfelt. It wasn't applause for a show. It was applause for a promise kept. Donovan turned to Malik once more. "I want you to hear this," he said. "Every sound, every response. This is what happens when people refuse to stay silent." Malik nodded, eyes bright. Suddenly, the cabin lights flickered and a murmur ran through the passengers. The screens blinked to life, showing a live feed from the boardroom in New York. On the screen were faces of Orionis executives, most notably Gerald Huxley, the board chairman who had sneered at Donovan's demands just days ago, effective immediately. Gerald's voice boomed reluctant but resolute. Executive board concurs with the directives. We commit to ongoing transparency, public reporting, and real-time equity monitoring across all operations. Welcome aboard a new Orionis. A collective cheer rose. Donovan felt tears prick his eyes. Evelyn tapped his arm gently. "Your father would be proud," she whispered. He pressed a hand to his heart. "We did it," he replied softly. Malik rose from his seat and walked forward. He stood beside Donovan, their presence a living bridge from past injustice to present hope. Then, in unison, the two men looked out the window as the plane cut through cotton clouds. They didn't need to speak. The cabin behind them whispered in awe. In seat 14A, a small card was placed on Malik's tray, an invitation to co-chair the Passenger Equity Council. Beneath it, a simple line, "Every voice matters." He picked it up, read it, and smiled. At the front, Kara walked back to Donovan. "The next flight is ready," she said. He nodded. "Let's clear more skies." And in that moment, as the Airbus gently climbed toward its cruising altitude, a silent reverence filled the cabin. No one would ever forget Passenger 14A, because Passenger 14A wasn't just a seat number. It was a story of restoration, a story of promise kept, a story of a sky that finally belonged to everyone. When Donovan Raye stepped off the plane in Vancouver, the terminal felt different. The usual buzz of travelers had the undercurrent of something grander hope. Cameras gathered at the gate as if expecting a dignitary. News crews stood back, respecting the weight of the moment. Donovan paused at the top of the jet bridge, glanced over his shoulder at his mother in 1B, and offered her his arm. She took it, standing tall despite the faint ache in her joints. They walked down the aisle together, side by side. Every step echoed a promise kept. At the bottom, Malik Harris awaited with 2 seats reserved for him and his wife. They rose, greeting him with a warm embrace. Behind them, dozens of passengers from Flight 274 crew members, early adopters of Code D, and curious travelers gave a standing ovation, not out of spectacle, but solidarity. In the terminal lobby, a modest stage had been set up. On it stood a sleek podium bearing the Orionis Air emblem and, beneath it, the Aeon Vest logo. Donovan stepped up to the microphone, setting aside any formal notes. He surveyed the crowd travelers, employees, media, and advocacy partners. Among them stood several members of the newly formed Passenger Equity Council, including Malik, Sonia Wright, and L. Sanchez. He cleared his throat softly. "Thank you all for being here." A hush fell. Even the airport PA paused. He continued, voice calm. "When I was 9, I watched planes soar across the sky and believed they carried only the chosen. Today, I stand on the ground, surrounded by people who remind me every seat in every cabin belongs to someone with a story, a family, a dream." He paused, letting the words sink in. But, too often, systems treat dignity as a privilege. Today, I ground that notion. Today, we keep these skies open to everyone. He gestured to Malik. This is Malik Harris. 2 years ago, he was escorted off a plane for simply being there holding a ticket he paid for. Tonight, he flew first class again. Today, he co-chairs our Passenger Equity Council. Malik stepped forward, nodding. "We're here, so no one else has to relive that moment in silence. This council will review every dignity complaint, advise on policy, and ensure accountability is real-time, not an afterthought." Donovan turned again to the audience. "Next month, our first Dignity Summit brings together airline executives, civil rights organizations, tech innovators, and everyday travelers to co-create industry standards, not optional guidelines, but enforceable protocols." He removed a card from his pocket, smaller than his shareholder badge, but just as significant. This is the Dignity Pass. Every crew member will carry one. Every passenger will see one on badge scanners. It's a reminder we commit every day, on every flight, to honor every human being. A wave of applause rose. It wasn't loud, but it was steady and sincere. Evelyn, standing beside him, leaned in. "You did it," she whispered. He looked at her with gratitude. "We did it." Backstage, Kara Mitchell and Lynn Tran exchanged a relieved smile. They'd helped rewrite the role of care in the cabin. No longer were they performers behind a mask of protocol. Now they were guardians of respect. Nearby, Sonia Wright and airport staff gathered around a digital feedback kiosk. It already displayed glowing messages from passengers' stories of small kindnesses and meaningful changes. Sonia tapped the screen. "This is the first time I've felt truly seen," she said, voice thick with emotion. L. Sanchez, who had pressed the dignity button mid-flight, added, "I'm flying again. Not because I'm braver, but because the system is now brave enough to hold itself accountable." Outside the terminal, a flight took off an Aon Vest chartered plane bearing a banner, "Orionis Air, a new flight path begins." It soared gracefully into the blue, trailing hope like contrails across the sky. That afternoon, Donovan returned to his office overlooking Lake Michigan. On his desk sat 2 framed artifacts, Marla Jennings's torn boarding pass and Sonia's resigned badge, both encased in glass. Below them, a plaque read, "From Denial to Dignity, a Journey Begins." He picked up his phone. A new message from the Smithsonian National Museum of American History. They wanted to display Seat 2A from Flight 392 in a permanent exhibit on civil rights and aviation. He smiled. "Make it happen," he replied. As dusk settled over the city, Donovan and Evelyn dined quietly on the terrace. The conversation drifted from policy to memories her childhood in Baton Rouge, his first home run in Little League, the countless nights they'd talked about belonging. She reached across the table. "Promise me one thing," she said. He nodded. "Promise you'll never stay silent again." She laughed softly. Promise I'll remind you if you do. He raised his glass. To voices, he said. To flights. She finished. They clinked glasses. Across the world, screens lit up with that moment. The hashtag, Silent No More, trended globally. People posted their own stories times they were quiet when they shouldn't have been. It became a movement, not just in air travel, but in workplaces, schools, and communities. In Seattle, a bus driver named Rachel bookmarked the Dignity Council website, planning to suggest a similar program in public transit. In New York, a boutique hotel manager emailed Orionis best practices. In Lagos, a college student shared the story in a campus discussion on systemic bias. That night, Donovan dreamed of an atlas painted with streaks of light flight paths weaving continents together, each line representing not just travel, but connection. He woke at sunrise to an urgent call. Dozens of airlines had reached out to adopt Code D and the Dignity Pass. They wanted guidance. They wanted partnership. He smiled and rolled over to see Evelyn sleeping peacefully beside him, her scarf draped like a banner. He leaned over and kissed her forehead. Ready for breakfast, he whispered. She stirred, eyes full of warmth. Only if I can order first class. He laughed softly. You always will. The plane has landed. But the story lingers in the air like the quiet warmth of a mother's smile and the sting of a boarding pass torn in half. Donovan Raye's fight wasn't just for his seat. It was for every traveler who's been made to feel smaller than their ticket, their dream, or their skin. Tonight, we've seen how love can power a silent revolution, and how a single act of bias can ground an entire fleet and still never ground our dignity. Carry this with you the next time you hear a casual slur, see an unjust policy, or watch someone shrink beneath another's stare. Stand up or simply stay seated, but never stay silent. Because every seat, every room, every dream is large enough for all of us. If this story moved you, if it stirred anger, hope, or a fierce kind of tenderness, tap the like button. Share this video with anyone who's ever felt out of place. And hit subscribe so you don't miss our next flight into truth. Drop your own stories in the comments below. Your voice might be the spark that grounds the next injustice before it ever takes off. Together, let's keep the skies and every space open, equal, and full of courage.